Hello and welcome. I'm Jay Dupree, content producer and host for the Upstream Content Studio. We are pleased to bring you today's webinar in partnership with Kongsberg Digital. We'll be discussing how to rewire for digital performance and resilience through a digital performance model. Today's webinar is part of several webinars in Kongsberg Digital's executive series to showcase why and how leaders must rethink digital transformation and advance towards the operating model of the future. Taking the reins as the moderator today is Miguel Valdez. Miguel is the Vice President of Growth Americas at Kongsberg Digital, where he has been instrumental in driving the company's expansion for over the last 5 years. Based in Houston, Texas, Miguel brings over 15 years of experience in the oil and gas industry, specializing in asset integrity and aftermarket services, subsea capital projects, and strategic business development. Prior to his current role, he served as the Director of Growth and Growth Manager, demonstrating a consistent track record of leadership and innovation. Our speaker panel consists of 2 speakers. We have Judson Jacobs, Managing Director at S&P Global. He leads the company's energy technology group, bringing together company strategies, innovation approaches, and regulatory and policy perspectives to deliver insights into the current state of the industry and its future. He has been with the company for 23 years and has worked with several leading companies in the oil and gas sector, including Schlumberger before that. His alma maters are Princeton University and Stanford. Also with us today is Havard Ostenson. He's the Executive Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer at Kongsberg Digital and responsible for the execution of the company's global commercial strategy. With more than 17 years of experience in the integrated gas, LNG, and upstream industry, Havard has a lot of experience to pull from. Now, before I hand over to Miguel, I would like to say that there is an option to submit questions for the Q&A throughout this webinar. If your question isn't addressed during today's session, we will hand the questions on to Kongsberg Digital to answer afterwards. From all of us here at the Upstream Content Studio, we hope you enjoy this detailed and insightful webinar. We have quite the session planned for you. Now, it's my pleasure to hand over to Miguel.
Thank you, Jade, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be the moderator for this discussion. And today we'll be discussing a topic that's really close to my heart, and that's return on assets. Companies that have embraced digital, AI, and co-innovation with a focus on decision-making are achieving 3 to 4% higher return on assets, which is exciting for our industry. Today's discussion will provide a closer look on what is behind these returns, including the growing role of co-innovation partnerships in using decision quality frameworks and digital performance models that leverage the power of visual. We'll also cover how we can stop reinventing the wheel and instead create industry advantages that improve ROA for everyone. Importantly, we'll round out the discussion by showcasing how digital co-innovation is playing an enabling role in addressing the energy trilemma of sustainability, affordability, and energy security, in addition to using digital to enhance financial performance. At KDI, we've been having conversations with industry leaders across the sector to better understand how co-innovation paired with AI and digital solutions is shaping the future of the energy landscape. Many of these themes come from the results of our State of Digital Co-Innovation survey conducted in partnership with the Energy Council. We'll share some of these findings as we move through the discussion and make the report available afterwards. And of course, I also want to take the time to thank you, Judson and Hobart, for being with us today. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right in, shall we? So we'll start with Hobart and Judson. Why do you think that greater co-innovation with external partners is so crucial for accelerating the energy transition? And of course, what's at stake if we remain fragmented or reactive in our approach?
So I can take the initial stab at that. Thanks for asking, Miguel. Pleasure to be here in this group discussing this subject matter as well. First of all, I think energy transition is a challenge that is more than an individual company challenge. It's really a systemic challenge, a systemic set of issues that need to be addressed in a way where we come to some integrated common industry solutions, much like the industry has done in the past, in terms of developing standards for safety, creating a more homogeneous field, a playing field, so that the underlying costs and, let's say, the challenges in implementation don't become too much of a barrier for the individual company to overcome. And so if we sort of consider the environment that the energy industry finds itself in today, it is an environment that has experienced quite significant cost increases. We've seen volatility in the commodities pricing. We continue to see geopolitical tensions. So it's a challenging environment. And if you, in addition, add on some of the expectations that have been bolted on in terms of ESG, clean operations, and of course, the overall societal expectation of energy transition, businesses can find it very challenging in terms of their cost base if they go into an individual set of R&D projects, as has been, unfortunately, past trends, where companies or smaller consortiums of companies have innovated for the purpose of course, overcoming the challenges that they have faced, but doing so mostly in silos. So in contrast, the opportunity to look at what the industry did in terms of coming to safety standards and taking that across to areas such as emissions, carbon capture, storage solutions, and value chain optimization, taking out some of the inherent information barriers that exist. We strongly believe that digital can be a lever in doing so, because it's already so good at sharing information. The technology, the availability of information exchanges exists in other industries. So this is more a matter of setting a new standard going forward. And so what's at stake if we remain fragmented or reactive? Well, slower progress on energy transition, I would say. And there are many, of course, we have the analysts coming out with many different projections for ranging from business as usual to very aggressive normative scenarios. But if we assume that we would like to approximate towards the normative trend, we definitely have to do more, and we have to look at every lever we have that is available to us to make progress. And we strongly believe that co-innovation, sharing best practices, and developing standards is a strong starting point to make progress on energy transition.
Yeah, maybe I'll just build on Homar's comments. Is that in very much view that co-innovation is incredibly important. I think most energy companies would admit that they don't have the capabilities to pursue a lot of these areas on their own, and this is especially true at the energy transition, where we're really moving into some new areas. And I know, whether it's carbon capture, whether it's hydrogen, certainly the application of renewables. And the idea that we're moving into some new areas and kind of drawing upon the collective capabilities and wisdom of a broader group is really important. And I think, Howard mentioned that, the cost side of this is that things still are too expensive. And that's perhaps why we're not seeing the energy transition move forward as we might. And the ability to be able to not only share the risk and share the cost associated with advancing some of these things is really important. But then you also draw in on a lot of the capabilities as well. So certainly, we certainly see that view, and as we observe companies that tend to be the most innovative and that are probably doing the most innovative things, they draw upon the full range. And whether that's large technology companies, we can all think of the names, but especially as well, kind of throwing the net a bit broader into some of the smaller technology startups that are kind of really, quite innovative and quite nimble. We've seen, some examples. The company that we really look up to is doing this extremely well in a particular functional group. They were just recognized by their executive leadership, and they are being given responsibility now to undertake responsibility for all of innovation across the broader energy spectrum in which they're involved. And then, I would echo Håvard's points around what's the danger, what's the risk, is that we don't move forward as fast as we might. And I think we all recognize that already the energy transition is perhaps taking longer than we would have hoped. And any years, days, months that we take longer is just more emissions that are being put into the atmosphere.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's the growing need and the strategic sort of environment requires it, I think. And so, on that front, how do we think that AI and digital solutions will help with, increased energy security, affordability, that trilemma you heard me talk about, reducing emissions? And then, of course, what does that do in terms of the business performance from that front as well?
Judson, I'll let you go first.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I would say is that the great news is that there is strong alignment between all three of these things, and whether that's energy security, energy affordability, and emissions as well. These things are not mutually exclusive, and you're not choosing to do one versus the other. What we find is that companies that are are adept in this area, or industries that are adept in this area, efficiency and productivity kind of stand out. Is that the most efficient and productive organizations tend to have the lowest cost around energy affordability. And perhaps surprisingly, they also tend to have the lowest emissions. A more efficient operation, whether that's being energy efficient, whether it's being operationally efficient, whether that's capturing methane that would otherwise be vented into the atmosphere kind of as a fugitive. All of these things are, companies that do this well are the hallmark of well-run organizations and efficient organizations. And there's a great example. We were working with one company that energy efficiency became a big focus of theirs because they saw their costs rising, and they were able to, and this isn't surprising, but about a 8% reduction in energy consumption strictly through the application of AI and digitalization to reduce their energy consumption, which they certainly patted themselves on the back for reducing their cost than 8%. But then, especially as the energy transition began to take greater hold, they also were able to point out that, by the way, we're also reducing our emissions by 8%. And so that's a not insignificant impact. Building on where we are with digitalization and AI is that this is really the sweet spot of digitalization, is that how do we drive efficiencies? How do we improve productivities? And so all the things that we're talking about, building on the investments that we've made for the last 10 to 20 years in automation systems and some of the digitalization components. These are things that we can do very quickly, immediately, and we can see that certainly kind of reducing costs anywhere from 10 to 20%, reducing emissions from 15 to 25%. Low capital intensity, we can see do them immediately, whereas many of the other potential opportunities may have larger capital expenditure and are going to take years to kind of get in, which is why you see that the low-hanging fruit, the first thing the companies are pursuing, oftentimes tend to be the ones that leverage digitalization capabilities.
I will take the opportunity to build on a couple of those things, Justin. So I think many areas where digital can be helpful, right? I mean, digital can be so many things, but what we found looking at the matter at KDI is that it's really a vehicle for decision making. And going back to your efficiency comments, right? What we have then seen in various collaborations that we have done and looking at studies and so on is that there's a strong correlation between decision efficiency and performance in companies. And that is very, very well acknowledged by companies. We just ran a survey across energy leaders that confirmed that view, that they would like to wire their digital solutions to go after decision quality and efficiency to drive performance. But we only saw at the same time in the same survey about 20% actual adoption of that, right? So there's a little bit of a gap between intent and execution. And if you take that and scale it up to the systemic issue of or the systemic issues of energy security, affordability, and overall emissions reduction, you need to expand the scope of your work to include more companies. And I think that this is where, if we acknowledge that we need to make better decisions to drive performance and efficiency, and performance and efficiency helps the energy trilemma, so essentially a counter to the challenges of the energy trilemma, we need to expand decision-making scope across companies. And that may sound a little bit abstract. So let's take a very practical example. Is companies right now model their own facilities and their facility value chain, or attempt to model them for optimal production, right? If your target objective is to reduce emissions, for example, or to provide a certain volume through a system, you need to integrate the sharing of information across that system so we can avoid unnecessary bottlenecks that are otherwise only visible in reactive scenarios. So if you have a shut-in on a pipeline somewhere on the value chain, the energy will not come to market. If you don't have full visibility on how to transport through maritime means, or how to integrate terminal offtake with upstream production, looking at pipelines across the system, we're going to have a optimal system, and that is actually what we have today, right? The contractual interfaces and the regulatory interfaces very much mandate the information that is shared, but there's so much more potential to share information to help with bringing energy to market, but also on just looking at the carbon signatures of that energy, right? And going back to emissions management, these are systemic challenges. So we do see that there's a need to open up and co-innovate. But once you do that, just like AI and digital now is starting to give you live debottlenecking abilities, looking at your performance in your facilities, you could debottleneck a system. This is more a matter of industry choice than it is technology. So we're very much glass is more than half full in terms of what we see, but this is about changing the way we work. But going back to decision making, thinking about that in a systemic way is something that where we really see that AI can be something that empowers decision making, and digital can help scale that decision making.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree that, it's especially, and I think with the energy transition, if the only thing we're going to see is these energy value chains are expanding, and so the interconnectivity between elements of these, whereas before you might have been able to optimize a single asset. Now what we're seeing is the kind of markets all the way from where it's being produced to where it's being transported and stored and used. It's so incredibly critical, and having that transparency across the value chain to be able to make the optimal and best decisions is so important. And I know that we've seen the example of CCUS and Northern Lights, and the value associated with having free flow of information all the way from the emitter to the where it's being transported and then to where it's being stored. It's critical, but you just need to get there, I guess.
Yeah, I think something that I've already touched on there, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in a little while, I think, but it's about changing that way of working, right? I think that's a very sort of strategic part of it. You can't just bolt on these digital solutions to what you've been doing for years. It's fundamentally rethink how we're doing it and what the value is for me as the customer, as the user of the technology. So it's an interesting time, and I feel like the possibilities are not lacking at all, right? I mean, helping drive more efficient operations and just improving overall performance. But at the end of the day, succeeding in business is all about performance. And so companies that scale their decisions for bottom line impact, we're seeing that they win. But the price of slow, uninformed, and ineffective decision making, we know costs the average S&P 500 company about $250 million annually, right? So that's not a small number. So my question to you, gentlemen, is how do we achieve business results with great decision making if we're struggling with our data quality and foundation? And where do AI and digital performance models fit in there? So yeah.
Do you want to take that one first, Ola?
Yeah, I can. I'm happy to. So this is where rubber hits the road. Because this is where a lot of discussions are, because it's easy to get executives to agree that decision making is important. There's broad consensus on many dimensions. So we did run a survey recently that showed on 6 or 7 dimensions of the decision making, there was 80 to 95% consensus that digital would be an amplifier in the decision quality. So now how do we do it, right? What kind of decisions should we prioritize? And this is, by the way, before I go into the detail, this stands in stark contrast to the data first approach, which has been prevalent for a few years now, where companies are trying to build large scale data environments to enable themselves to later make greater decisions without necessarily targeting those decisions specifically. And that's something that we have seen held back progress over the past years as we have engaged more and more in discussions in industry. But how do you select those decisions and work backwards from the decision output and performance that you want back into the digital maker? Well, one big temptation that people fall into is simply ranking use cases by highest value. And then you end up with, and that's fair enough, you may end up with 50 use cases that are real problems, people understand them, they can maybe be quantified. But if you sort only by, let's say, the economic impact or the financial output, right, you tend to get all these high tailoring use cases. And this runs counter to the inherent benefit of digital being a scaling vehicle for businesses, right? This is how we have perceived sort of digital in our personal lives, e-commerce, scaling up, more transactions, more visibility, more opportunities, and automating away simple tasks, making things like, going to the bank is not something that we do much more. We actually have a digital solution to do our bank transactions, right? So what we saw when we approached this in industry is that we take a similar lens, where we focus on the lower value, higher frequency tasks that allow you to scale quickly. Because people are hungry for results. Digital has been out there for, I believe, at least 10 years. We talked about digital transformation and digitalization. It's not something new. But the sort of the boldness to pick a smaller use case, something that is interfering with your efficiency on a day-to-day basis, putting in place, then you can go and say you could put in place the IoT, the data capture, the contextualization, and the digital real-time delivery of information to that specific decision context. You can narrow the aperture on the data, actually, by being specific, and then scaling out those closer to autonomous decisions. Of course, a lot of those decisions are going to be taken by humans for the foreseeable future, but you can start building and structuring business processes and workflows, leading you very quickly into the decision-making space and trading off with the sheer data volume that you're processing on the back end. This is a way where you can achieve multi-asset scale, and hopefully, since we're talking about energy transition and systemic issues, you could scale some of those time-consuming activities like instrument calibration, filter changes, and a long range of sort of in-field activities. If we took away the attention, or at least made it easier to execute, you could shift the attention to the more analytical problems, or the problems that require more analysis and divergent thinking, judgment calls where humans are better. And you can also envision a world where you can bring together teams who can do that in a better way, looking at the same information. So essentially, when you mentioned digital performance model, Miguel, this is what we have essentially built in KDI. It's a system that allows you to look at framing, logic, KPIs, and data together, and then drive a commitment to action that actually ensures that the work gets done as well. But we strongly believe that looking at the simpler tasks first as we go about implementation will help a lot for driving performance through digital.
Yeah, if you wait to get started until your data and your underlying infrastructure is in the perfect state, and it's probably going to be a long time before you get started. So the advice, I think, for most folks is just to do it. Just understand the constraints and understand the limitations of what you may have today, but just move forward with what you're able to do. And we've seen some of the most innovative companies, recognizing the constraints, working with the data that they do have, putting things in place and really using that to drive performance improvements and drive efficiencies. And it's amazing. And it's once you do that, or to your point, is that, you don't need to have the highest value things first. You can have, what's the most vexing or what's the most challenging. You begin to get the business engagement, you begin to get the business trust, and that builds upon itself. And then what you do is, and you also, as you begin to, just move forward with some of these initiatives, is that you begin to see where the limitations are in the data, and you can begin to make the investment cases or put the effort forward that's required to actually get things in better shape. Maybe we're not getting, data from our OEMs. So we need to either, speak with them or revise our contracts to ensure that we do. But it really builds upon itself. And then, I think the question that we'll be talking about, throughout the webinar, the second half of the webinar is the scaling aspect. And what's the most effective and what's the best way to be able to do that? Certainly being able to have some of these success cases throughout the organization is a pretty good move forward. But then how do you build on that as well? And how do you deploy that at scale across your organization rather than having it be limited and kind of constrained to a single asset or a single operation? But I think the advice both Håvard and I are giving is to just do something. And so with whatever you might have today.
Yeah,
I
sorry, Miguel, you go first.
I was just sort of to, thinking through it, right? Obviously, we know you don't need to try to boil the ocean. We talked about this a lot. I know Håvard and I talked about this a lot, where we have vast amounts of data naturally, right? But we don't need everything to do a specific thing, right? So when we get started, when we talk with folks about getting started, it's about orienting yourself to what you need to get started. And it's not everything all the time. But then, beyond that, when we talk about that high frequency, low value sort of philosophy that Håvard mentioned, I think the interesting thing there is when we talk about decision quality and the value of decision quality, when you take those, I don't want to say monotonous things, but the things that you're doing all the time, and you help automate those things, now you're enabling the people to focus on the high value things that really deliver more to the performance of the business. And so that's where I get excited about when we see that level of adoption and that way of thinking as these technologies being adopted at industries. Håvard, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I know you had something else you wanted to say.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, some use cases for people, some very practical things we mentioned, the filter changes, shift handovers, bringing in sort of backlog from last shift into the next shift so people can cut down their shift handover time, and really enabling other activities to happen, right? That's the essential starting point philosophy. And you can get, quite mature on some of those use cases activities as well. I mean, we worked in a chemical injection case. There was a specific chemical that was injected into a lung tieback for hydrate prevention, right? And we're able to take targeted data sets, focus on the decisions that we'd have to make in terms of the dosing aspect of it, and then build automation on top of the data with decision framing that allows this decision to go very close to autonomy now, right? So repeat activities, whether they are chemical injection cases or running continuous energy optimization loops, where you in the past perhaps have been dependent on having some type of manual data collection step that informs your dosing or your order volume or something like that. That's where data can, and where that process is quite conformed, right? You got to assess it for conformity. And if you have some, a good idea, hopefully, of the variables and parameters and the weights that go in, a strong hypothesis, it's a good starting point. What's not a great starting point is high tailoring, where you early have the observation that the assets in question actually have a very unique requirement. You may be able to unlock a lot of value there, and you should probably go after it. But the way to think about it is, if you free up time from the repeat activities, you can put more horsepower on a complex activity, which could be dealing with a complex integrated CCUS value chain in conjunction with production. They have to be run together now. Electrified assets, how to run this in the most economical way, and so on. That's going to require, in the interim, more intellectual horsepower and divergent thinking. So it's the way of approaching the problem and daring to say, okay, I'm going to take a use case that I can repeat, maybe in upstream, midstream, and downstream, then I'm going to focus on scaling that out. And then I'm going to take the freed up capacity and do the, for example, complex turnaround project in parallel with my freed up capacity. And you can use digital for that too. But it's all about sort of how you help position. The last thing I'll mention is the importance of feedback. So what we have been emphasizing for a while now is get to the end of the work process. Make sure you can see that it's completed and that the work was done. And if it's not completed, it goes into a visible backlog of incomplete work, right? So that you don't lose threads. And this has to do with sort of the human psyche as well. That feedback, instant feedback, digital instant feedback actually drives behavior. So you can let digital be a driver for adoption in of itself. And that's where you want to be with these initiatives.
Absolutely. And you started to touch on some use cases there, right? So, one thing I wanted to ask about was, we know that a lot of companies face the same, very similar problems in many cases. How and where can we stop reinventing the wheel? And what sort of use cases come to mind on that front to leverage that?
One of the things that I think, perhaps is identifying, there's solutions that are being created, all around the industry. So maybe there's a number of things that you can kind of think about. One is that identifying what areas are competitively differentiated, or that you can perhaps do faster as well, which is what we're seeing a lot when companies determine where and how to develop some of these technologies. But identify areas where perhaps suppliers are best positioned to undertake some of these and leverage that. But whether you develop it internally or externally, the real focus then becomes, and I think scaling up is a theme. You've already heard this word a few times from the two of us, and I think you'll hear it some more as well. But determining how best do you kind of scale up so that you're not inventing the same thing in multiple parts of your organization. And how do you do that? There's different ways. You can leverage platforms like digital twins to do that. You can leverage your functional groups. You can leverage centralized monitoring and surveillance capabilities. Lots of different ways to ensure that what's being developed is getting into the hands of the engineers and the field workforce, and is being improved and refined along the way. But I'll take one other aspect as well. Not reinventing the wheel is one thing, but how do we continuously refine the wheel even faster as well? And that's something that digital and AI are incredibly well positioned to help us do. And both Håvard and I talked about, kind of how costs are a significant barrier to the energy transition moving forward quickly. How do we leverage digital and AI technologies to accelerate the innovation cycle to bring down cost? And I know that sounds like a mouthful, but I'll give you an example where one company is at least kind of focusing on this. Occidental Petroleum, that's deploying a lot of direct air capture units in the Permian in the U.S. These are largely out of the money right now, but they are continuously identifying that over time as they develop and then deploy the next one, the tens of ones they're going to be deploying. They're leveraging that and they're partnering that together with digitalization. So they have a digital twin on each one. They're optimizing how to operate those owing to ambient conditions. But they're also aiming to feed that back into the innovation cycle so that iteration number 2 and number 3 and number 4 are less expensive, less cost, and more efficient and more productive. And that's what we need to do. We need to come down the learning curve even faster than we otherwise might if we're going to accelerate the energy transition.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic case. Over.
100%. And it's all about, I think it's that feedback loop that if you see that it helps to co-innovate, you're going to continue doing it. And I actually feel that being in the supplier position in this ecosystem, right? I feel like we bear a responsibility of informing the industry that, hey, you are actually trying to reinvent the wheel in many places right now. So and we see it. Companies are trying to do the right things, but they are sort of in their own innovation loops, and a lot of things are created and from basic capabilities, technical capabilities to use cases. But we think that there would be a huge benefit if people rethought whether these items are a creative competitive advantage or not, And if not, is there an opportunity, right? And so this has happened before in with cloud, like 10 years ago. High performance compute, we all know the term, and it's around still for some reason, from specific reasons, like seismic data processing, for example. But companies used to purchase their own data centers or operate, virtual machine farms, and they did a lot of specific tailoring and adaptation to those. And what we have seen is a lot of cloud being more or less standardized in terms of expectations, not being the same products, but being being products where you can have a certain expectations to how those products will perform, and then the companies migrate up the value chain in terms of the competitive advantage. So the competitive advantage becomes more on the decision making, how you construct your teams, how well they work together, how you allocate the resources, how you structure your portfolio, etc., which seems more sort of commensurate with the general idea of how at least a mid-sized to large energy corporation should work. So I see it as we need to start having the conversation. I think we have made some steps in instituting the co-innovation partnership on our side, which is essentially a doer tank that talks about or addresses the barriers and generates solutions, and we bring in companies to discuss that with us. But we need more momentum, and we need more companies to sort of acknowledge that, or maybe refine the work on their competitive advantage. Now, the good news is that if we were to imagine a digital layer that operated more like what the cloud does today, so you know what you can expect from the digital versions of your facilities, the information exchange capabilities, the API standards, what you can get out of cross-company use cases, maybe in the interface where supply meets demand, so you can share information and break down some of those operational and contractual buffers we have today. Then you will start to see that the optimization that has been normal to try to strive for within the company can be a value chain opportunity. And again, we are just so used to operating in silos in the energy space, where right now most of the work goes into de-siloing large companies from an internal perspective, i.e. having reservoir to market visibility for your hydrocarbons or your CCUS, right? And expanding that into the ecosystem. And I think, just to use CCUS as the future-orientated example, right? Now, this is a very complex value chain, many participants. And I'll use Asia. I mean, you mentioned Northern Lights. That's also a good example to look into. It's multiple countries coming together, multiple parties coming together and co-innovating and creating an operating environment for this. If you look at Asia, you have the LNG value chain from Australia into Japan, Korea, and it's now needs, from a CCUS perspective, that would have to be reversed to access the saline aquifers in Australia, and you would have to have endpoint emitters connecting to a value chain. And there's so many challenges that need to be solved by co-innovation anyway, from insurance to risk forwarding to how you address impurities at the endpoint emitter and how that eventually could impact downstream, and sharing of risk and understanding sort of an integrated operational environment there. So it's these problems are already acknowledged as integrated problems that touch multiple parties on the value chain. So if we can accept that we already acknowledge that, then the next step is really to co-create the solutions. So the good news again is that it's not a technology barrier. This is for us to come together and create the right frameworks. The last thing I'll end on with this answer, or my take here, is that it appears to be that the biggest challenge is in trust. And that is something we all collectively have to work on. But there's work to do to get more specific, understand what are pockets of value we can access on these value chains where there's agreement. It seems to me that if we build on safety in industry, we have a good starting point. So can we expand the platforms we created for standardizing safety and sharing of information safety and build that into these value chains and into the really challenges that the industry needs to solve? I think we'll be in a better place.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's interesting. You both touched on, a couple of the same things. It's, maybe rewiring or revising our perspective of what is competitive advantage is one thing. When we think about that, we think about what we're trying to solve, what challenges we're trying to solve. I think it's important to consider these are significant challenges. They're huge, really, and we're not going to solve them on our own, right? So we know that it's the value and the speed and the scale at which we can work on these things is going to be much more efficient when we come together to do those things. But Homer, like you said at the end there, it's about trust. We talked about that a lot. I think it's incredibly important. And building on my previous question, in your view and looking ahead, what should we prioritize to create shared industry advantages and accelerate progress with AI and digital co-innovation? And Judson, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, and I think these are a lot of the points that we've kind of touched upon already. So I'll reiterate a few, but what we just touched upon is identifying where competitive differentiation lies and what areas that you should focus on internally, because there is still competitive differentiation. And I think, especially as we move into the energy transition, there are areas as companies want to build a business out of some of these areas that you would try to maintain in-house. But it's letting go of those other ones where, either there's shared resources or shared capabilities that we should be drawing upon and identifying what are the true differentiators. Certainly the delivery mechanisms, I think we've all recognized, we'll kind of get into this. There's been some really great success cases, but how do we ensure that gets scaled either, across your organization or across the industry as well? And then again, I mentioned a few different means, kind of digital platforms and other things to more readily get these things into the hands of some of these things. Last, there's a couple ones around having this true kind of maybe life cycle mindset. So the idea is that as we were building from major capital projects, we're operating them all the way through to operations and then, and beyond as well as we kind of decommission them. But it's this view that how do we optimize kind of across, and how do we perhaps bring suppliers in at different stages of the development and the operations life cycle that maybe we hadn't connected them before. And I think, especially as one of the things that we've seen is that when you begin to move into a new area and you're trying to have a new operating model or operating philosophy, ensuring that the automation and control companies are there at the start is very important to help to identify that. And then lastly, something we haven't touched upon, but Håvard was getting into that with some of the examples of LNG and elsewhere. But in many cases, and you have mentioned this, is that these aren't the same companies. And if we're going to optimize kind of across different energy value chains, we need to ensure that we have the contractual terms that are either, number one, that we can get the information, get the data, or once we've made the optimal decision, is that we can actually execute on that. And we have the contractual flexibility to be able to ensure that we're doing the right thing. So all those things kind of come together. It's not one thing, it's lots of things to accelerate and make sure we're getting value from this.
Yeah, I think just I want to build on that for a second as well. And so in a past life, I was doing a lot of work in commercial LNG, still from a systems perspective, but more so in business management, and I helped structure a few of the trading operations of a few companies and their gas operations. And it occurred to me as I was doing this that we have a lot of we are solving for an environment where we have very little information visibility, right? And the prime sources of information that come from counterparties and other places are what's regulatory mandated or what's mandated in your contracts, right? And this is very much so across the energy space, right? If you are agreeing very much on a pre-planned schedule how much you're going to send into a pipeline or how much you're going to take out from it, and then if you believe that there could be upsets downstream, then you're starting to buffer in the upstream for eventualities that have more like experience-based, or perhaps if you're advanced, a probabilistic equation behind it. But it tends to be quite linear. And in the pre-digital age, it was based on mostly experiences with historical data and people sitting and modeling in spreadsheets and having experience and maybe exchanging some information. But this is far from optimized, and there's much more information, operational information within those silos that could potentially help lower the buffers. And I do attend a lot of energy events, and I hear the people who are in charge of the systems talk about the challenges, and a lot of energy and potential is lost in the system just because it is so buffered. So if you're looking at performance, if we could demonstrate that cross integration drives higher performance, then you can be in a better place. And simple examples like if there's a interruption in the downstream that causes an upstream entity to need to flare or shut in production or something like that, there should be enough inherent motivation with those parties to try to integrate and stimulate more information sharing to prevent those events from happening across those value chains. You mentioned projects, Judson, and I want to make sure this gets into this webinar as well. I looked at a really interesting graph that was published by an analyst firm at a conference I went to a couple of weeks ago that showed that the reason why we are seeing such rapid scale out in the renewables is because these must be scalable operations that inherently benefit from modularity and standardization within the modules, right? And it was contrasted against the larger but also necessary energy projects that need to commission to meet the energy demand of the foreseeable future. But in those spaces, with the large EPC contracts and the more tailored specialized solutions, modularity can be a challenge. And as a technology provider, we are often on the receiving end of parallel inventions in terms of specifications for how these systems should work, but these are clearly made by the companies in silos. And if we Pareto these, you see a great opportunity for something that can lead to industry standardization and we believe better performance, which ultimately from a business standpoint means lower cost to do your project because you're more efficient. You can accelerate your time to first oil or first gas or first whichever commodity it is, but you run a leaner, tighter project with more automated QA, QC and data visibility. You can get to more efficient projects, which benefits the industry. And then obviously we have talked a lot about the operating model today with decision making, but if you can also become more efficient there, then you're looking at overall lifetime value increases in terms of asset valuation, in terms of performance and so on. So I think it's important to recognize, since we're talking about digital, and many still see digital as the IT organization coming in and delivering a project. But it's really, what I would frame it as is it's more like the equivalent of the lean process that came into business, in the 80s, right? It's a way of running your business. So that's the next sort of horizon, is to acknowledge that and then to bring in the co-innovation aspect that makes it more standardized and modular and even more scalable. The good news is technology, again, has come to a point where it is hyper-scalable. We are, of course, seeing a lot of the AI, the Gen AI, the co-pilot discussion and integration of that into the business. And that's important, and it will drive decision making. Let's not forget about the opportunity to standardize for scale.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're pulling on my heartstrings there, right? When we talk about how it applies to everything through the life cycle, it's not just in one place. It's not an IT project, to your point, but when we think fundamentally about where the value exists and really facing the problems that we all sort of deal with as companies, it's a shared issue that we can work on together and we can solve together. So I think that's incredible and really insightful. We've got a few minutes left, and as we're coming towards the end of the session, I do think we have enough time to answer a couple questions from the audience. So let me take a look at that real quick. In your view, why is the future promising when it comes to AI and digital performance in the energy transition? Håvard, I'd like to start with you on that one.
Yeah, so I'm definitely glass half full on this one, and more than that, because we've been going through this very challenging operating environment in the energy industry now, right? Cost increase. We have seen regulatory environments that put more pressures on. We have seen the ESG requirements come in. They do add, they do a lot of good things, these things, but they also add to the cost base. So they ultimately challenge the energy security and affordability to a certain extent, right? So we have these, I would term it a non-linear increase in complexities operating in energy now. And so we're very dependent then on the commodity price being right for things to be FID'd and for returns to happen. The good thing about digital is that it is an exponential value accretion, right? And what I mean by that is that you can get decisions made in seconds that you would in the past have to go on month-long projects to find information. So we talked a lot about sort of the basic wiring, i.e. make sure that we're working with purpose and that the decision quality, the decision output, and the performance output we want. And then we work backwards from there, right? It's a very important nuance in how we work so that we don't boil the ocean with data. But then let's say we assume that we got there, and then what's next? There's some really exciting things that are next, right? We've just seen the introduction of the co-pilots. The pilots are still in place, but it's getting there. And things, wading through 100 engineering specs to try to get to a decision on whether we maintain a pump or if you do some tuning to the operating regime, if you run a bypass line or whatever. These things can be heavily advised by AI in a quality way. And we're seeing sort of the reasoning and the traceability and the trust coming up too. So there's a lot of otherwise very challenging activities that can be augmented heavily and decisions can be accelerated. Have not even touched on agentic AI yet, but just to give you a little flavor of what's next, right? Can you imagine you dispatch a team of AI agents that work together with each other to find that information, check on each other's biases, and surface a balanced information set into your decision. Like we used to call like crawlers, right? That we go and grab the information and bring it up to the surface. This is some of the next horizon that's coming. So we're very focused on getting the basics right. Like focus on decisions, end-to-end execution. Don't let go until you completed it. Make sure you capture that data. Don't boil the ocean in terms of digitalizing all the data, but focus on that sharp end. That's what's going to enable you to ultimately get the most value out of the new constructs that will come, because the data volume will grow. So you're going to have to get purposeful on your data as well. But if we do these things, it's fantastic what we can do. If we open up for co-innovation, if we set sort of an industry platform level, a set of expectations for information sharing, we can debottleneck the energy system. We can make it clean. Like I'm personally convinced of this. So you could say I'm probably on the more positive side. Anyway, I'm curious about you.
Well, so I'm excited about the future because we've seen the future. And we've seen, it's certainly not here at scale, but we've seen so many incredibly innovative examples, and whether that's around doing things to improve productivity, improve efficiency, reduce emissions. There's a lot of really great examples out there in the industry. Some of them are applying digitalization in more basic forms. Others are using more advanced AI. And still now, even generative AI, even though it's just entering the industry, is that we're already beginning some use cases and some agents that are running on a regular basis. So the challenge, of course, is how do we get this at scale? I mean, that's really what we've been kind of hammering on here for a bit, is that how do we ensure that when you develop some of these really effective use cases, is that they get into the hands of the engineers and technical workforce. They're used, and then the information that's used and the recommendations that are generated are acted upon. A great example, one of the really curious ones that I find is this marriage between traditional AI, machine learning, and generative AI. Because one of the things that's been holding us back in applying some of the more perhaps black boxy type AI solutions is that you have engineers who don't trust it, or you have technicians who don't trust it. So what they're using now, we're seeing examples of generative AI explaining to the engineer how it actually came up with this recommendation and trying to take, some of that transparency and remove some of the opaqueness. So I thought that's a really great example. That's how do we kind of shift and how do we kind of, begin to drive deployment and scale and overcome some of those trust issues that Håvard, also kind of raised, in a number of different examples. But super excited. I just, really excited to kind of see some of these really impressive examples see the light of day and really kind of be deployed more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you both touched on a little bit, right? But it's continuing to evolve and it's developing rapidly, right? So we know what we know today. It's going to keep changing, and we have to keep thinking about that and what that means. So I think the future is exciting, like you both said. I think we have time for one more question. So let me look here. What advice do you have to ensure companies receive the benefit and value digital offers? Judson, you can take that one first.
Well, this is probably a good wrap up. Is that how do you ensure that your the benefits and the values, and making sure that you're focusing on the right things, and whether that's doesn't need to be the most massive thing that moves the overall needle. How do you ensure that you're pursuing these in a way that's going to be most effective and also most rapid? Is that whether that's doing in some cases internally. I know this is the co-innovation webinar, but in some cases companies will but being open to working with those, the broad range of knowledgeable organizations and entities. And I don't want to say companies because it may be academics, it may be a technology startup, it may be, a think tank somewhere, but bringing in the right capabilities at the right time. And then again, I'll say it once last time, is that deployment at scale and figuring out the most effective way that works within your organization. It's not going to be the same thing for everyone. It's kind of identifying where, what are the pathways that prove to be most effective, and building on those and recognizing your strengths and just trying to, go at pace and go at scale.
So I'll try to summarize it with a couple of points. Don't boil the ocean when it comes to data, right? Be very purposeful, focus on the critical decisions. Look at the decisions you need to make to be successful. Also as an ecosystem, right? This doesn't stop with the company, but what kind of decisions? And then how can I best support that decision? And then you digitalize. And when you digitalize, you don't let go until the job is done, which means following the work from inception, where the data sources are, until it actually completes in the field with a technician or with automation. Of course, we're going to get there too. But by focusing that way, you can have a much leaner and surgical and much quicker returning approach. And the last is really important because you got to return value. Let's face it, it has to be value-based. Stakeholders are in violent agreement here. It must return value. If not, it's just another system that I need to deal with. So unifying the work in those environments, focused on decisions, that'll drive better outcomes. And then of course, be open then, like on the topic of co-innovation. Be open to the hypothesis that you're reinventing the wheel right now. So engage in the discussion. Of course, we have our co-innovation partnership where those that are interested in participating are welcome to come and have these discussions. We're really trying to help the industry up its game, so to speak. So co-innovation, decision-making, and surgical precision on outcomes, and digitalizing for a purpose, and scaling out those wins. Then you will get to large-scale digitalization.
Yeah, and just to add something that you both mentioned as well, right? You got to get started. And it's not just about digitalization for the sake of adopting whatever the latest tech trends are, but it's about making sure that you're focused on driving tangible business value and enhancing customer experiences, et cetera. So it's an exciting time. We're just about out of time. So I do want to take some time just to quickly summarize what we discussed. We explored the role of AI and digital co-innovation in driving financial performance in the energy sector, and how companies are prioritizing digital co-innovation with a focus on improving and increasing that decision-making quality, and how they're seeing, upwards of 3 to 4% increase in their ROA, the return on assets. We discussed how the industry could achieve higher ROA by creating industry advantages and making it easier for companies to stop reinventing that wheel that we've talked about here a little bit. And for those or the listening, the audience, to learn more about this and the power of digital co-innovation, we invite you to read our State of the Digital Co-Innovation Survey that we conducted in partnership with the Energy Council, which can be downloaded from the resources button on the right hand of your screen there. And with that, I'll hand back over to the Upstream Content Studio.
Thanks, Miguel, for taking us through this webinar. It was a pleasure having you as our host today. And thank you to our speakers, Havard Ostenson and Judson Jacobs, for their time and expertise. This concludes our last webinar in this two-part series and our last webinar with Kongsberg Digital in 2024. Today's discussion focused on how to rewire for performance and resilience in a digital world. Please remember to recommend this webinar to anyone you think will benefit from it and download the report provided by Kongsberg Digital. You can find this around your screen now. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you in the new year.